Senator Bellemare. Thank you so much, everyone. I recall with gratitude that we are gathered here on unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people for time immemorial. And I'm so proud to be here with many senators from across this land. Thank you so much for this wonderful way to end this adventure. Of course, I'm very moved, and I will read my notes because I worked hard on them. But I also want to be sure to remain composed. So, leaving the Senate after 12 years of parliamentary life that frequently provokes adrenaline rushes is not done with indifference, as you can imagine. It's the first time in my professional life that I've been the oldest. It's true. I was the youngest for so long, but now I'm the oldest. The eldest. I am the eldest. Which leads me to share with you what I've learned over those 12 years. Because it's true, I did change affiliations a few times, but I was always faithful to my oath. The oath I took when I was sworn in, and I've always listened to my conscience. As Senator Lankin said last Tuesday, all senators in this chamber have achieved great things. They're all first class. It's the first thing you realize when you get to the Senate. You say, oh, that's interesting. In my case, as our former colleague, André Pratt, wrote in his book on the Senate, and as several said, it's true, I am an intellectual. It's through the intellect that I garner my experiences, my knowledge. And in my case, I became more practical later on. I spent time in the Quebec government as well. And, of course, I was an academic. Now, I decided to, someone told me to show up if I wanted to change the world. So here I am in politics. And I think it was a wonderful place for me. My adventure in the Senate was not part of my career plan. I didn't choose to become a senator because at the time, one was called to the Senate. In 2012, when I was approached to assess my interest, I was obviously flattered, but I was writing a book then about sharing wealth and creating prosperity. And I was trying to make peace with the idea of retirement back then. I was 63, but I'm very glad I accepted this honor and privilege, the full extent of which I did not realize when Senator Carignan, whom I didn't know very well, told me that my name was on a short list. So, are you interested? I was appointed to the Senate in September 2012 by the Right Honourable Stephen Harper, whom I thank for his confidence. At that time, the Senate had just gone through an existential crisis that began in 2013 around what the media called the Senate expenses scandal. It hurt every time I heard them say that. All the senators, especially the newly appointed ones, were traumatized by the experience. The crisis brought to light a reality described by Judge Charles Vaillancourt in his decision exonerating ex-Senator Duffy concerning the stranglehold of the Prime Minister's office on Senate affairs. A number of political scientists have documented just how easy it is for a Prime Minister to control the Senate when it is bipartisan, i.e. composed of two caucuses. And it is the Prime Minister who decides on appointments. So that's quite simple. Since Confederation, the reality is that the Prime Minister's office has always acted in such a way as to obtain a majority of votes in both chambers. The party in power then simply imposes its party line on the Senate through a system, an informal system of rewards and punishments, and that's it. However, I have to admit that sometimes some senators, often those in opposition, have found ways to oppose effectively when necessary. So that doesn't mean the opposition is silenced despite party lines. Colleagues, and particularly those newly appointed to the Senate, don't be surprised if you occasionally wonder what planet you've stumbled upon. That was my case too. That's why, on my arrival, I undertook a little research into senates around the world. Being an economist by training, my advisor at the time, Etienne Gabris-Forget, and I worked together to draw up a number of statistical tables of senates around the world in order to obtain an answer to the following questions. Is bicameralism in good health? Is it growing or shrinking around the world? I wanted to know whether senators were generally appointed or elected. What was the scope of their mandate and power? Were there other bipartite senates like we have in Canada? Are there independent senates? The research still exists and it would be good to update it, but I can tell you that bipartite senates are rather rare. There is the American Senate and a few other in small island countries belonging to the Commonwealth. There are very few senates where there with just two caucuses, two groups. At the time, Canada's bipartite Senate, and this is still the case today, was the only one to be both bipartisan and appointed until the age of 17. In most senates, senators are elected. Obviously, that has pros and cons. So bipartite senates are rather rare. There's the American Senate that I mentioned, as I said. And it was through this comparative study and other reading that I quickly realized that to ensure the institutional independence of the Senate, and I repeat, the institutional independence of the Senate, there had to be at least 3 groups or caucuses, because then it would be more difficult for one group to obtain an absolute majority. And that absolute majority be controlled by the party in power. So, following that study and my reading, and it was at the time going through that crisis as well that I mentioned, that I started to repeat whenever I could the need to break up the two-party system. To that end, the crossbenchers in the House of Lords emerged as a possible model for the Senate of Canada. I'd like to tell you an anecdote in greater detail. It's the one Senator Dalphond mentioned. In the summer of 2015, I was still affiliated with the Conservative caucus, and many Liberal and Conservative senators were wondering about the future of the Senate. Senators Green and Massicotte organized a symposium on the subject and produced a survey to find out senators' opinions on various issues. For my part, I argued for the importance of the Senate being made up of several groups, but I wasn't certain how far I could go as a senator since I belonged to a caucus. So in the summer of 2015, thanks to the good counsel of Natasha, my advisor at the time, who worked in my office, I was able to meet with the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. As I was explaining my discomfort with the situation, he interrupted me to say, look, it's clear we need more than 2 groups in the Senate to counter the dominance of the PMO or the Prime Minister's office. He himself had been Prime Minister. He understood the dynamic quite well. He confirmed my analysis and the need to change things. As for my intention to quickly work towards the creation of a 3rd group, he added, but perhaps you should wait until after the next election, which was to come in the fall of 2015. I did follow the advice of the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, and it was on March 8th, 2016, a few months after the election, that I became independent or unaffiliated, along with other unaffiliated senators, including Senator Ringuette, who at the time suggested setting up regional caucuses or groups, having also reached the conclusion that we needed more than 2 caucuses. And we're the only 2 left from that era who started the Independent Senators Group. It was an informal group because we did not meet the criteria to form an official an official group, and obtain official recognition.
Back to my experience with the Conservative Party. I learned so much, and it helped me think about other subjects. Because I said, if I don't want to follow the party line, how can I decide on the bills that come before us? I should have good reasons to not follow the party line if I'm going to object to bills coming from the other chamber, which usually pass. So, I was wondering, what were the objective criteria when it comes to passing bills? What did they have to meet in terms of criteria to get my vote? So, in 2016, I proposed a motion in this place, better known as Motion 89. It intended to amend the standing orders to require committees considering bills, especially those coming from senators and MPs, to include in the report tabled here observations and answers to a series of questions, important questions that could sway or not one's vote and lead to rejecting or accepting the bill. For instance, does the bill respect the Constitution, the Charter of Rights, Indigenous and international treaties, privacy? Have any individuals or groups presented strong objections at committee? If so, which ones? Was there adequate consultation? What's the regional impact of the bill? If there is one, and is there cause for concern? Are there any errors in the bill? Are the English and French versions consistent? And so on. So there was essentially just a list to check off, which seemed to me useful. And it helped people who did not have the time to go and read all the testimony presented at committee. This motion, as I said, intended to succinctly analyze and present the information that senators needed in order to decide on a vote, in order to form an opinion. It also was a way to consider how to use our veto on bills passed in the other chamber with the support of almost all the parties. I told myself that I didn't have the right to object to a bill just because I didn't like it. I don't think we really have the right, even if we do have the power, to refuse to pass a bill with clear support from the other chamber. It comes back to playing the political game, in which we are not legitimate players. We are not entitled to the arrogance of political legitimacy. Motion 89, as you know, didn't pass. However, it was discussed by the Modernization Committee, and there's traces of these discussions in the committee's reports. Personally, I use this grid when I have questions about a bill, especially bills introduced by a member of parliament or a senator. And I look at my list. If I don't like it, that's it. And if all the criteria are met, I'll vote in favor. It allows me to decide on a bill passed in the other chamber without having to worry about my personal preferences. After all, no one person, no matter how brilliant she may be, can appreciate all the points of view of a reality. It's too complex. The motion never passed, but perhaps one day it may come back in another form. In May 2016, I accepted an invitation from Senator Harder, the first government representative in the Senate to take on the role of the invented title of legislative coordinator. And Senator Grant Mitchell became the first liaison officer. It was an intense time for me in the Senate, especially since I had no practical experience with the rules. I did not know them by heart as some colleagues in the opposition did. It's one thing to read the rules and quite another to apply them. And I'm very proud to have been able to work with Senator Harder and Senator Mitchell, both of whom I hold in very high esteem. Now, at the time, we had no assurance that government bills would be passed. On a few occasions, government bills received royal assent by just one vote. In the case of a bill that I sponsored, and whose critic was the formidable but sympathetic Conservative Senator Tanis, we succeeded in passing that bill. It was the one that repealed bills that were considered to be anti-union. A little anecdote about the first budget. At the time, the opposition group of Conservative senators had the majority of seats. Some Liberal senators weren't cooperating with the Trudeau government after the events that we all know, the events that led to an end to their participation in the Liberal National Caucus. The budget did pass by one vote again. The budget passed by a single vote because exactly the right number of Conservative senators were absent from the chamber during the vote. The official opposition leader, Claude Carignan, knew how to count. He really knew how to count. I have to say that Peter and I broke out in a cold sweat a few times, and you can imagine how relieved we were. We ended up laughing to release some of that tension. And some know the rest of my story. In the fall of 2019, I joined the Independent Senators Group, and I left it in 2021 to join the group of Progressive Senators, with whom I had and still have a special affinity. No, dear colleagues, many of you are friends. Know that I respect all senators, regardless of their affiliation. If I changed groups, it was because of a disagreement, and in the case of the ISG, there was a difference of opinion, a different vision for an independent Senate. So, with all due respect to my colleagues in the ISG, I'd like to point out the nature of this difference of opinion, which I think was a decision I made to protect the multipartite system in the Senate. And it has to do with committee portability. According to the rules, and I'm saying this for newer senators so that you remember this is important. According to the Senate rules, a senator who leaves a group remains a member of the committee assigned at the beginning of the session until the end of the session, which may occur when the session is prorogued or an election is called. This rule, 12.2, dates back to time immemorial. It was codified at the end of the 1960s. And the wording that we know is a little more restrictive than the one from the 1960s, but the wording we know dates back to 1972. And this rule is found in other senates around the world. Senates that are multipartite. In recent years, however, this rule has been suspended. A senator who leaves a group or caucus loses their committees. This rule is in the standing orders, but it's been suspended during this session by a motion passed at the beginning of this session. I'm against this because this rule supports the independence of the Senate. It ensures a balance between groups and between senators. It's a matter of fairness. I think this rule is wise. It protects a fundamental principle, which is to ensure that each senator can continue their work at committee with the integrity of the privileges conferred to them by the status of being an official member. This rule is good for senators, and it is good for the Senate. For those who know the philosophical principles of John Rawls, this rule would certainly be adopted under a cloak of ignorance by equal and rational individuals. For more details on these principles, you can talk to the former professor, Senator Gold, whose an expert on the principles of John Rawls. I speak of this rule with conviction because it allows a healthy amount of mobility between groups of senators. In 2015, it allowed senators who wish to become unaffiliated to do so and still allow them to assume their constitutional responsibilities in the Senate. Forcing a Senate to leave their committee seat if they leave a group is punishing them for acting according to their conscience, and I think it undermines the Senate's independence. Before I come to the thank yous, please know that the Senate is an important institution. The work that we do is also important. When we first get here, we can think that this Senate is just a formality. It's required before royal assent. But today, I know that that is not the case. And you will learn quickly that that is not the case. The Senate is a political institution with enormous powers, different from those of the House of Commons. It's not our role to govern. However, we are the bulwarks of democracy. As the title of a book published by the Honorable Serge Royal emphasizes, we ensure that democratic choices made in elections respect the well-being of all Canadians and Indigenous peoples. To use a sports expression, we're mainly defensive players. And to remain significant or meaningful and appreciated by Canadians, the Senate must remain independent of partisan jockeying, respect democratic choices, and show restraint, as the late Senator Shugart so aptly put it. If our work is primarily to protect democracy, that means we can also be a visionary and shed light on long-term public policy issues. We have the opportunity to do so, and we have the duty to do so. I would have liked to talk more about social dialogue between governments and socioeconomic groups, and the latest Horizons Canada report entitled Disruptions 2024. In an inquiry on the notice paper, that won't be possible. Nevertheless, I'd like to draw your attention to this document. It lists 35 major and probable disruptions that could affect Canadians' well-being in the medium term. It talks about Canada's demographic problems, immigration, artificial intelligence running amok, downward mobility becoming the norm, food becoming scarce, men in crisis, young male adults in crisis, men who don't know what's real and what's not, and conflicts of values that are dividing our society. Energy becoming scarce, household debt at a critical point, and so on. Horizons Canada is asking various public bodies, departments, governments, political parties to take this into account in their projects and their work. I think the Senate is the chamber that must reflect on these issues, especially at committee, in order to fully play its role as a chamber of sober second thought. I invite you to consult this report. Horizons Canada is an organization that's part of the Department of Employment. Quickly, I'd like to share with you my belief in the importance for Canada of establishing institutionalized dialogue between governments and socioeconomic groups. I think we're experiencing a crisis of governance in this country when it comes to public policies. The public policies we need to work together on solutions to challenges and disruptions that lie ahead. You may have seen this at committee when we have many bills coming from MPs and senators. They seem to be there to fill a void, but they seem to lack coherence and scope. As you know, in free and democratic societies, it can be challenging to bring about coordinative, collective action, more so than in democratic and free societies than authoritarian societies. However, coordinated collective action is necessary. In Canada, we have to strengthen and institutionalize dialogue between governments and socioeconomic partners, as is done elsewhere in the world, because the invisible hand of the markets is not enough. Senators can encourage this dialogue and promote it. It's within the scope of our power. It's an opportunity we have. And I would like to encourage you to read the latest chapter produced by a group of senators during the pandemic, chaired by Senator Harder, the Prosperity Action Group. We've heard so much testimony, especially from international sources. It was so interesting. We met often, and everybody knows what to do. It's not knowing what to do, it's how to do it. How do we put this into action, especially in Canada, within our system? It's so complicated. To conclude, colleagues, your work is important. Take it seriously. At the same time, don't take yourself too seriously, because sometimes it can be hard when we encounter challenges if we take ourselves too seriously. I would like to thank the Senate team who ensure our material well-being and our physical safety, all the staff who transport us from building to building and allow us to work in beautiful, clean spaces, all the security guards who protect us. Special thanks to Greg Peters, the bailiff of the Black Rod. I want to thank the staff who work behind the scenes on a daily basis so we can do what Canadians expect of us. I'd like to thank the interpreters. Thank you today, without whom we wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. All the audiovisual staff who help Canadians look at what we're doing, judge our work, and all the pages who make our daily lives comfortable. All the clerks who support us and ensure that we are well informed and that meetings in chambers and in committee run smoothly. Thank you so much. I have the utmost admiration for the Speaker of the Senate, who always listens and does an exemplary job, and the President pro tempore, who manages our work with aplomb. I'd like to thank all the people who worked with me in my office over the years and helped me take on my role as a senator and made me look good, as Senator Dawson often said. I'm thinking of Anita Galindo, who helped me in my first years in the Senate come to grips with my role. I'm also thinking of Nassim Derdoui and Etienne Gabriel-Forget, who left us and whom I've already mentioned. Thank you to Natasha Entwistle, Véronique Valenti, Alexis Fafard, Eileen Hu, and everyone else who worked at the Office of the Government Representative. Special thanks to Amélie Crosson and Marty McKendry. They were always on hand to offer me advice. Special thanks to Julie Labelle, with whom I had the pleasure of working and who combined intelligence and kindness and supported me for 6 years. I want to also thank Hermione Tomoras, an experienced lawyer, constantly on hand to support me on the Rules Committee and in the drafting and progress of Bill S-244. I want to thank Jeremy Soucy and Alexandre Matar-Michaud, with whom I worked for a few months, but of whom I have fond memories. My time in the Senate wouldn't have been the same without the constant support of the exceptional labor economist and friend with whom I've worked during many periods of my life. I'm talking about Michel Cournoyer, who supported me throughout this journey, and even before, when I was a senior civil servant in the Quebec government. Finally, before my personal thanks, I want to thank Anne Allard, who worked in my office for almost 2 years, without whom my life at the Senate would have been chaotic at this end of my professional life. I want to thank her for her dedication, her availability, and for being the beautiful person she is. I have a special thought for all my friends who have passed away. Lise Poulin-Simon, my soulmate with whom I wrote several books and who died far too soon, and Professor Jack Weldon, who also passed away. Both still support in my mind the boldness of my projects and the strength of my ambitions. I also want to thank all the colleagues who know how to listen and all those with whom I had special conversations over the years. You all know who you are. I also want to thank senators of the Progressive Group for their warmth and their friendship. Dear friends, I love you. My friends and my family, at last. Special thanks to my husband, Victor Altmed. He's an immigrant who came to Canada in 1969 as a Polish Jewish refugee. He's the man of my life. the father of both of my children, Simon and Bliss. I adore him, and he keeps me young at heart. Victor came into my life on the eve of my 40th birthday with two beautiful and wonderful teenagers. He gave me the opportunity to have a bigger family than expected and grandchildren. So these wonderful teenagers, David and Sarah, are people I love like my own children. I thank Victor for giving me the opportunity to experience motherhood and for his constant encouragement in everything I've undertaken and his ambitions for me. Without him, I wouldn't be here. Thank you, Victor. And thank you, Bliss, Simon, Sarah, David, and the grandchildren, Ariel, Elijah, Isaac, and Hannah, who are here. I intend to seize the opportunity to spend more time with all of you, and I want to thank my brother, my sisters, and my parents, who are no longer with me, for everything they've done for me. I also want to thank my friends for keeping in touch during these 12 years when I was less available. I've got some catching up to do. I loved my life in the Senate. I will miss you. And I will follow along. And perhaps we will see each other during the next adventure. Thank you.
Bravo.